Mega Man! That's about all I can contribute to that sentiment. I don't have any history with Mega Man whatsoever, and after a quick Google search, I'm not surprised. With how young I am paired with the fact that the only Mega Man content in the world of gaming for the past decade has been dominantly legacy collections of the many series this franchise holds, I'm surprised I even know who Mega Man is. The only new games in the past 10 years to my knowledge were Mega Man 11 and a Mega Man X mobile game, apparently. But of course, 8-year-old me needed some way to fill the Mega Man-shaped hole in my heart, and that's where Shovel Knight came in. I grew up with Shovel of Hope and eventually found out as an early teen that there were 4 of these games, because somehow I missed out on that part. I got the collection and now hold those games as some of my all-time favorites. This love for Shovel Knight inevitably led me to look a bit deeper into the inspiration for the games, as why wouldn't I want to play the games that paved the way to my favorites? And so, since I only had legacy collections to choose from when it came to Mega Man, I decided to start looking into this franchise's surprisingly massive library. There were 4 main series, those being Classic, X, Zero, and Battle Network, but I was looking for more traditional gameplay, so I decided to ignore Battle Network. Maybe another time. Instead of choosing the classics, the ones that were probably the closest inspiration for Shovel Knight, or even the X games where the gameplay still seemed traditional to the classics with its own mix on the formula and gameplay, I chose Zero, the one that was probably considered the furthest from Shovel Knight series in essence. I'm not entirely sure why I gravitated to the Zero series as much as I did when choosing which of these games to play. Well, for one, it was probably wanting to play a complete package instead of 2 Capcom, but there are probably a myriad of other reasons the more I think about it. For example, some of my other favorites include more fast-paced action games such as Dead Cells or even Katana Zero, so seeing gameplay footage of people just barreling through the stages with sword in hand had me extremely compelled. Speaking of swords, the more melee-centric combat definitely hooked me in, as not only is it something I'm more comfortable with, but I find that it leads to more interesting boss fights in combat overall. I could probably keep going, but you get the point by now. And after having played through the whole collection, by God what a good choice that was. I have absolutely fallen in love with these games, and how they evolve over the course of the series. But before I get ahead of myself, I need to talk about the game that started it all. Mega Man Zero. Or rather, Mega Man X. The game takes place around 100 years in the future, where a creation of Dr. Lights was discovered, the same doctor responsible for the creation of the first Mega Man in the classic series. He named this new creation Mega Man X, a robot who was too advanced for his time of creation, holding the power of free will, thought, and emotion just like any human. The person who discovered X, Dr. Kane, was able to use his design to create robots of similar design, called Reploids. Reploids were made to help humans, but naturally with the free will they have, some started to rebel against humans, in which those rogue Reploids were titled Mavericks. To combat this newfound threat, a group of Reploids was formed by Dr. Kane to hunt down Mavericks, given the genius title of Maverick Hunters. The leader, Sigma, eventually found a robot of another long-gone scientist, Dr. Wily, former rival of Dr. Light. And this robot was Zero. The two fought, Sigma coming out on top but having contracted a virus that was stored in Zero's headpiece. This eventually made Sigma turn into a Maverick and would start a war, again appropriately titled the Maverick Wars. Zero, however, was brought to Dr. Kane and repaired, no longer being hostile. He became the new leader of the Maverick Hunters and would soon find himself fighting alongside X. And honestly, there isn't much else you need to know about Zero, as about 100 years after the X series ends, we find that he has decided to give his body to science, being sealed away to have research done on him, eventually sparking the events of all future games in his series. Now that all of the backstory is out of the way, we can finally talk about the story of Zero One. It immediately starts off with a group of people being chased by a group of robots. They are completely outmatched until the remaining members meet a hibernating Zero. A fairy-like robot sacrifices herself to reawaken the legendary hero, who is asked for help from a girl named CL. Zero immediately jumps into action, beginning the game. As someone who went into this game with bare-bone knowledge of the franchise as a whole, this opening to the game was fantastic. The instant power struggle between friends and foes, paired with Zero immediately willing to help with no hesitation, as any of us would, we would all protect the best girl, no doubt about it. But back to the topic at hand, the whole intro sets expectations for the game's story really well. Character introductions were also spot on. The main 2 points of focus here, and for nearly the entire series, are CL and Zero. We see CL as a more caring figure after seeing her brief interaction with Passy, the fairy-like robot we see at the beginning. CL expresses concern for her sacrifice, showing how she doesn't want to put them in danger or lose them, which is a good display for how she later views Zero for most of the series. Zero has just as strong of an introduction, not even stopping to think twice about helping somebody in need. CL simply asks for help and the mission immediately begins. It shows Zero's will to protect those in need, something that gets explored much further into the series. Before escaping, CL gets captured, to which Zero struggles to defeat the behemoth pit against him. Halfway through the fight, an unknown ally comes to help Zero, giving him the Z-Saber, which Zero uses to take down the robot in one swing. After returning to the Resistance base, CL reveals the situation of how X has become ruler of a city named Neo-Arcadia, a human paradise through forceful peace. They have been accusing innocent Reploids of being mavericks in the name of keeping peace, and the rebellion wants to protect those who are innocent. This conversation also reveals Zero's memory loss of his past, which is another point that will get touched up on in the future. Other than that, the story doesn't really start taking center stage until near the end of the game, and the only notable things to happen before coming upon endgame levels are the introduction of the 3 Guardians of X, Harpuia, Leviathan, and Fenfer, representing the 3 elements you get throughout the game. While we don't see much of these characters in this game specifically, they do become recurring characters throughout the series and even appear in the ZX games to my surprise. Oh, wait, Phantom exists. Don't know how I forgot about this guy, he's one of my favorite boss fights in the game. I wonder why I don't recall him appearing in later. Ah. Well, 3 Guardians are more than enough anyways. We finally reach a point in the story where we can now progress to our final attack against Neo-Arcadia. This is also where the big twist is revealed that the X ruling Neo-Arcadia is a copy of the original, one created by CL herself, but due to the urgency of the moment, it doesn't get discussed until later. When the topic does inevitably come around again, we see Zero be completely accepting of CL's choices, saying how she had the best intentions at heart, making her justified in his eyes. Then, after the Mega Man Boss Rush TM, we go to our final encounter. The Guardians, or at least what's left of them, go to confront Zero only to be stopped by Copy X. The two talk for a short while, Zero confronting Copy X's treatment of Reploids, while Copy X simply says it was to keep Neo-Arcadia peaceful. The two fight, Copy X shows us where Phantom got those sweet moves, and the place just explodes. Finally, we see Zero laying down in the desert, having ended up there after the explosion, where the spirit of the original X, the mysterious person helping us all along, comes to talk to him. X expresses how he is tired of having fought during the time Zero was asleep, asking Zero to take his place and to fight for people and Reploids, which Zero does with no hesitation, going into the desert to fight off hordes of bots, ending the story. This finally wraps up the story of Zero 1. I really didn't expect myself to talk so much about the story, as I'm definitely a gameplay over story type of guy, but I feel like I'd be doing injustice to the game if I didn't cover the world that was built up in the X titles for the Zero titles to continue from, and how the Zero titles actually executed upon building up that world. And as of writing this, I found myself to really become more engaged with the characters and overall story as I looked into it again, especially with the perspective of future games. But that being said, this game is definitely lighter on story than its successors. Now, I want to talk about Zero's character a bit more. One big theme that gets explored for Zero, an otherwise static character across the 4 games, is what his motivation or reason for fighting is. While it doesn't get much spotlight in this first game compared to later titles, I feel that the final talk he had with CL about Copy X and the ending showcases his general motivation really well, that how he is willing to fight for what he and others believe in, and he often reflects that through the conversations he has across the entire series. One other scene that I initially skipped over is the second factory mission, the one that newer players all despise, having to do with a bunch of tight wall clinging and whatnot, but that's for later. This mission feels like another good showcase of CL and Zero. The factory is occupied earlier in the game for the Resistance to have energy, but Zero goes to check up on it, encountering Phantom, and after their fight it's revealed that Phantom has rigged the place with explosives. CL immediately calls for Zero to evacuate upon finding this out, but Zero infiltrates the factory to de-arm it. CL, realizing there's no talking Zero out of it, proceeds to help him. This really encapsulates both characters well. Zero most likely knows how important the factory is to the Resistance and decides to go protect it despite perfectly being able to leave in that situation. He does it because he believes it's the right thing to do in that situation. Meanwhile, CL encourages Zero to come back for his own safety, but then starts to help him to the best of her ability once she realizes he won't come back. It presents CL as yet again caring, but capable when the situation calls for such a thing. I also like the Guardians in this game. They didn't have much time to shine, but they did get their personalities across pretty well without being annoying in any way. Plus, I can't remember where I heard this, but apparently they were all based off of Copy X, as in he created them or something like that. Makes sense, as we've seen some Guardians even share some of Copy X's abilities. Also, it took me way too long to realize the typical robot grunts you fight are basically copy-paste designs of Copy X. It was probably due not to having played any of the X games, so I'm not really used to his design yet, but I was still a bit embarrassed by the realization. Regardless, the Guardians were a nice addition to the eventual long-term cast. On the note of Copy X, I do find it interesting how he turned out to be evil when he was a direct copy of the legendary Hero X. While researching the story a bit more, I found out that in the X games, X was initially sealed away, as Dr. Light feared he wasn't ready for the world and would need X's system to be checked for the next 30 years before safely showing X to the world. Light knew he wouldn't live to see the day, and thus sealed X away, expressing great concern for the dangers X could hold. I think it would be safe to assume that Copy X was put out there without these sort of system checks for 30 years, making it so he just wasn't ready for the world. Copy X ultimately fights for humans and has their intentions at heart, so he isn't inherently evil, it's more just he doesn't have a moral compass yet when it comes to the treatment of other Reploids. A neat detail for the game that also helps to make Copy X feel like a less forced villain in the grand scheme of things. One interesting thing about the story, though, is that X was actually meant to be the original villain of the game, but due to other releases, it was canned and replaced with Copy X. This would have been an interesting aspect to see, as in X4 there is a scene in which X tells Zero that he wants Zero to kill him should he ever go Maverick. It would have been an interesting dilemma for Zero during the final fight, but at the same time I feel like it would have been harder, if not impossible, to have some of the more bittersweet and memorable moments, along with different plot threads later on in the series had the initial plan gone through. Copy X still feels like a natural inclusion in the story with what previous games had set up, so I feel like the story would have been solid in either direction it took, although I feel like I'd prefer Copy X as the villain. Overall, simple story, does well to set up for future titles as well as introduce strong characters that stay consistent not only through this game, but for the series. Can't ask for much else other than that, really. Now that the story has finally been covered, we might as well take a look at the art and music, starting with the art. I was a 3DS kid, so most of my childhood games were in 3D models. Point being, I wasn't exposed to much pixel art growing up, outside of Shovel Knight and, I guess, New Super Mario Bros., but I still don't know if that's just terrible 3D or actual pixel work. I have recently gained a new admiration for pixel art, especially sprite animations. That love mostly came from Sonic Mania and, believe it or not, Shovel Knight. But this game has now helped to fuel that love. I have to say, I was really surprised to learn that this was Game Boy and not DS, but then again, if it was DS, it'd have some sort of touchscreen gimmick, so I probably should have figured that one out sooner. Regardless, the art in this game is quite good. Nothing groundbreaking, but there are plenty of cool animations for Zero and most bosses. The stages themselves feel a bit lacking in terms of interesting looks. The only things setting apart most stages for me were mostly which parts I found annoying instead of actual set pieces or the locales being visited. But at the same time, the game plays it pretty safe with most of its missions and locations, so there wasn't much variety to begin with. It doesn't excuse the lacking backgrounds, but this issue isn't overly prominent. It just makes the game much less recognizable from looks alone. But my favorite part of the art would have to be within the Resistance base and the lab where Zero was discovered. Both locales have pretty good atmosphere for what it's worth, especially the Resistance base. My first time playing the game, having CL explain the state of the Resistance and then getting to explore the base, it really did feel like a place I was struggling to stand on its own two legs. That combined with the pretty bare-bone mission structure, which also added to the general atmosphere and was something I surprisingly preferred to later games, made this my favorite of the 4 games' base of operations, with 4 being a close second. And the character portraits that pop up when talking to various people is always a fun touch. They don't go into too much detail here and only show one expression per character, so it's nothing to gawk at. Still, I find it to be a nice touch rather than just pure text, and while characters still can't show too much emotion in these frames, since they only have one each, I still feel like they capture the vibe of each and every character pretty well. Except CL, I don't really know what face she's trying to make there. But one major part of the art is the changes Zero's designed from the X series to his own. Obviously, I'm somewhat more used to the latter design due to having played all these games, but I will say I do prefer this design over the OG look. I like how they tried making him look way less like a robot and more human, which I feel plays into the theme of how Reploids and humans aren't that different in the grand scheme of things. But god, some of this official artwork, give him some armor, he looks half naked compared to the OG look at times. And while we are comparing the two series, I definitely prefer the style the Zero games went with compared to the X games. Mega Man X still looks great, but I generally prefer the sleeker designs used in the Zero series. Zero just looks like he's meant to go fast in this game, and I love it. Art style just naturally suits the type of game Zero strives to be, and I love it for that. As for the soundtrack of the game, I wouldn't really call it anything to write home about. Since the game is structured in a way where you revisit levels often, the entire soundtrack is the smallest it has been in the series. And I wouldn't really say most of it is memorable, the only exception that really comes to mind being Zero's main theme. The rest of the soundtrack does a good enough job to set the tone for each level and scene it plays in, but some tracks are a bit repetitive after a short while, the biggest offender being the Resistance bass theme. If it wasn't carried by its other themings, then god, I would not like this bass as much as I do. Again, the game's soundtrack is very short, so there aren't many notable songs to showcase. Although, 2 other tracks I did enjoy listening to upon going through the OST were the themes for the train and factory levels, titled UG Express and Hell Plant respectively. I also found the name of Hell Plant to be quite funny for reasons we'll get into a bit later. Generally speaking, the music in this game gets the job done, just a bit repetitive across most tracks and generally lacks a sense of memorability. Finally, it's time to get into the meat and bones of this review, the gameplay. Now, I've already mentioned how I haven't played any of the Mega Man or X games, so I don't have much to compare between series. All I really know is that Zero goes from run and gun of X games to the new slash and dash we have here. Platforming takes a backseat, for better or for worse, as the new core gameplay loop sees the players constantly moving at full speed, slashing anything that even looks at you funny. This is especially reflected by the ranking system, but I'll be able to get to all that later. One aspect that still stays true to the usual Mega Man experience are the boss fights and the weakness system they use in this series. For those unaware, Mega Man is known for its system of being able to play through all the levels in the game, save the final levels, in any order. Bosses will usually have a weakness to a weapon gained by defeating another boss, which creates an optimal route in a sense for being able to effectively defeat bosses. This system was simplified in the Zero series, and even the ZX series, to be rock, paper, scissors scenario. Fire beats ice, ice beats electricity, and electricity beats fire. I really like this simplified system as it allows for much easier experimentation of what works and what doesn't, plus it's quite easy to remember. But I do have two major problems with it in this first game. First of all, the bonus effects of using these elements on your average enemies does nothing significant. Ice freezes the enemies, thunder paralyzes the enemies, aka Ice 2.0, and fire gives a slight damage effect. Woohoo, how exciting! These elements only feel here to have the typical Mega Man weakness system in the game and don't have anything going for them outside of that. This does get solved in future entries by having the elements interact with the environment more, but it feels very forced here. At the very least, it sets up good base for future titles and eventually lives up to its potential. But my second issue ties into the weapons, which overall ties into the biggest problem I have with this game. Maybe second biggest. I'll get into it. Before getting into the flaws, what is the weapon system and overall combat like? Well, the game gives you 4 weapons: the sword, buster, triple rod, and shield boomerang. These 4 weapons cover the basics pretty well, having melee, range, a mix of the two, and then a defensive option. And when you mix and match these weapons at their full potential, it can allow for some extremely cool combo game and generally opens up the combat in an interesting way the more you look into the tech of the game. The key words in that sentence were full potential. All of these weapons have nearly all their abilities locked off initially, in which you unlock these abilities by using the weapons in combat. And these weapons are extremely limited in their capabilities in their base form. Elemental attacks can only be used by charging weapons fully, which is an ability locked off for 3 of these weapons, in which all are unlocked near the final levels, meaning you have to grind to actually be able to use the weakness system of this game, that again doesn't even interact with half of the game. Add this to the fact you don't even receive 2 of these weapons initially and you have to wait half the game to use them, at which that point you just stick to the Saber and Buster as they have more abilities unlocked at that point since you've used them more often. What was the logic behind this system? It doesn't help that these weapons have a weird level up system where certain moves help you level up quicker and none of this is really communicated to the player. It's just frustrating to say the least. If you know what you're doing or using a guide to grind efficiently, it would still take 20 to 30 minutes to fully grind all the weapons to max, which is just a shame with how fun the combat becomes when you eventually unlock these options. I believe the goal here was to try and make a sort of Metroidvania upgrade system, as it does seem like the game had Metroidvania inspirations in ways I'll discuss later. What the issue is here is that it makes the character feel limited, the exact opposite effect of what I assume was intended. Instead of feeling like a powerhouse at the end when your weapons gain full potential, it only feels like you get to play the game properly for the first time instead. The rest of the time you're just being held back by these confusing limitations, and especially considering you can't even use the game's weakness system right off the bat, something that makes boss fights go at a much more appropriate pace than the 4 health bar slog a good few are like. It's just a strange design choice that limits the fun a player can have when going through the early stages of the game, making it much harder to replay than future entries would be. Speaking of stages, what are the missions like in this game? The game actually takes a very bare-bone approach to the mission layout, where instead of having a bunch of frames with the bosses pictured, it only lists off the literal tasks you need to do. Sometimes you just won't even get any description of the boss. And I actually quite like this approach. I feel it adds to the immersion of helping out a small struggling resistance. The missions themselves are centered around a few locales, in which there's typically 2 missions for every area. Doing the first mission of an area will usually unlock the second. Add on the 2 mid-game boss fights and the final few endgame levels, and that's the entire game, basically. And before I talk about these missions, I actually quite like the routing of this game. Routing has always kind of been a stronger suit for the Mega Man and X games, as figuring out yourself which bosses have what weakness, or which boss abilities you need to get what items and stages, it's always an idea that I was pretty interested in, and so I was pretty happy with how they dealt with it here. Having the secondary missions locked behind needing to do the first creates interesting routing paths. What's even cooler is how you don't even have access to the main 3 elements instantly. First one you get automatically, but then the second one is hid behind a somewhat mid-game mission that's a bit harder for the player, and the third one isn't even accessible from the initial list, you having to do a few, and it creates this really cool routing strategy, especially for ranking, as if you want to keep a high rank, you can either do the easy stages, but it might take a bit slower without all the chips, or you can just go straight for the hard stages, which will make the easy stages even easier, guaranteeing high rank, and I'll explain why that's so good later, but it does actually create a lot of cool opportunities that I didn't even expect, and I actually, again, preferred this routing compared to what other games do, as future titles have much more segmented versions of this system. Anyways, time to start going through all the missions. Disposal Center is the first mission after the quote-unquote tutorial, and it has a good amount of platforming by this game's standards, along with an interesting wind mechanic that gets severely, and I mean severely, underutilized. I only discovered it when speedrunning the stage in the collection's bonus mode, and it's a shame because it's a very fun concept in practice. Just missed potential, and it's very weird to me the more I think about it, as this game heavily focuses on speed, and so player movement was very fine-tuned in the game. I honestly think it's perfect. It controls excellently. And yet this mechanic that directly influences your movement just goes completely unnoticed by most, if not all, casual players. And it's barely communicated. It's so strange to me. Because, again, this is a fun mechanic. It's just, why did they not try and push this further in the stage? God, this is only the first stage. It's good. Oh man, I'm not ready to talk about the rest of these. The first desert stage is a good example of this game's lacking level design, where it feels like a glorified straight line with enemies shoved everywhere for the sake of it. Add in a terrible escort mission forcing you to traverse the whole stage backwards, needing to clear all the enemies again only for the escort to die due to off-screen attacks, and you needing to restart the whole escort mission. I don't even want to go in depth about how easy it is for this NPC to get left behind with the small screen size and the speed difference between you and the NPC. It's truly just the worst level in the game by far. There's nothing redeeming about it other than a kind of mid-boss fight. Woohoo! God, thank God I don't have to play this one too often. The second lab mission also falls victim to just being a straight line with enemies. There isn't a single semblance of platforming to be found, and enemy placement feels somewhat obnoxious, especially in tandem with the spinning hazards, which are fun to jump around on their own, just not while I'm avoiding all the bullshit the game decided to throw at me. This level is also one to feel very hard to navigate due to screen size, as well as often just enemies being just about out of sight until, too bad, you get smacked in the face. quarter of your health gone, bye-bye. The escape sequence also just really encapsulates how bare this level is with no enemies in sight, leaving the only thing slowing you down to be a bunch of closed doors and how fast you can mash the dash button. Just a bit disappointing overall. Train level has a bit more platforming and good enemy placement. Add in a nice mini-boss and a kinda cool wire mechanic and you have this game's version of peak level design. Basically, it's not a straight line. While the art doesn't do any favors to give this level any sort of personality, it is one of the more enjoyable ones out of them all. So, we take it. The second train level takes place over a now broken track with floating and falling platforms aplenty. This is one of the most platforming heavy levels in the game, and it stands out just for that, despite lacking any personality yet again. And also, yet again, enemy placement actually feels well thought out instead of the typical spam, so train levels are 2-0 for good level design. This is wild, we rarely see this in this game. Then there are the two hidden base missions, which are both extremely similar to one another. First has you traveling over an ice lake, making this a literal straight line, along with a fetch quest to save some prisoners, across 3 straight lines. The second mission now has boats in the lake, which you need to get on top of by going under first. Somewhat interesting, but it's just 2 straight lines now. First has you waiting and risk of getting crushed by the boats, and the second has you moving up and down slightly as you get spammed by projectiles, along with a very fun blind jump. There aren't many blind jumps, not as many as people claim to be in this game, but this is literally a blind jump. You just kind of have to know it's there, which I have the object permanence of a toddler. I honestly forgot there were 2 ships, had to look up how to complete this level. I feel a bit silly, still not an interesting level. Just forgettable due to a bunch of boring mechanics, especially the first. I mean, nothing's going on in the first mission. A prison break sounds like fun, and then they even try incorporating stealth mechanics, like, yeah, let's give this level some personality. But then you realize getting caught just entails having to deal with 2 things. Enemy spam, and being forced to wait to save the prisoners. That's not fun. Just not engaging. Bad level design yet again. The factory levels were actually both levels I initially hated before falling in love with them upon second and third playthroughs. They boast the most unique set elements, personality, and platforming of any stage. While there is one section with robots carrying platforms that's especially rough on beginners, once you learn the lay of the level and how to cling to walls to best see your surroundings, the level honestly picks up in quality a lot. The first mission has you simply traversing the factory with a stealth segment that's fun. Or if you get caught by the cameras, you have to race to the door before it closes, where it switches the gameplay from stealth to speed, instead of from stealth to slow the fuck down for no reason. The best part about this stage is that there's actually an optional path on the top that bypasses the stealth section entirely, although it is slightly harder. Plus, you actually get rewarded for it. This is followed by the segment I mentioned earlier, having to platform over a bunch of moving platforms while the factory has a few unique set pieces trying to knock you off. Caps off with a pretty solid boss fight, making this an amazing stage in my eyes. And then this boost in quality for stage design immediately continues with the second factory stage, starring everyone's favorite guardian, Phantom! He doesn't even explode this time! This is a great fight, followed up by a fetch quest to retrieve all the bombs planted in the factory. The difference between the fetch quest of the prisoners and the fetch quests of the bombs is how the bombs are completely speed-based. There is no waiting around, you are put in a timer, very lenient timer, doesn't matter, and you're told to go fast. Blast through the stage, it's great. It is a bit frustrating upon initial playthrough due to not knowing where all the bombs are, and some of them being in relatively tricky spots. Again, just a bit of trouble seeing where platforms are if you don't know how to wall cling tightly. But once you do learn the locations of these bombs, it is genuinely a great mission to just absolutely plummet through, getting every single bomb along the way. And yeah, it's just my favorite mission in the game. The speed-based elements combined with a solid boss fight that actually takes place at the start, which means that the level starts at 100 and actually keeps up the pace with a fast mission requirement. Like, it's great, I love it. The second desert mission is just miles more enjoyable than the first, which it's not saying much. I'd be more impressed if they actually did make a worse mission than the first desert level, but regardless, it has a cool Super Mario Bros. Style of side-scrolling where you can't backtrack, making this a mad dash forward through the enemy spam. And honestly, that's kind of fine, at least they're encouraging speed. I remember the second lab mission especially was annoying just because most of the enemies were kind of there to be inconvenient, just constantly slowing you down. Combine that with the stage element of these spinning beams that would just constantly force you to slow down and wait. It wasn't that fun. But here, you know, there's nothing really slowing you down, so while the enemy spam is inexcusable, it's still more fun in this format, so thumbs up for the overall level. It does an alright job at being something enjoyable to play through. Then there are the final 3 levels set in Neo Arcadia. First 2 are nothing more than just bare-bone platforming with a dash of enemy spam, topped by mini bosses throughout both stages. Any new mechanics added are just uninteresting, annoying, or both. Actually, I can't even remember any new mechanics off the top of my head, other than those disappearing platforms, because those were a good idea for some reason. But whatever, final stage is your typical Mega Man Boss Rush TM, which isn't too bad, save for the final boss, which I'll get to. The final boss is back-to-back with this boss rush, however, making it a pain to have to attempt this level multiple times. Genuinely the only time I used save states upon my initial playthrough, and unfortunately this trend repeated throughout the entire series, even the ZX games. I really don't know why this was such a popular design choice for these games, with just how annoying it is. I mean, maybe I'm just spoiled by Shovel Knight, which always puts the boss rushes right before the final boss, and then the final boss wouldn't even have any platforming before, so you could just get straight into the fight. But, you know, that's... mistakes have been made, can't change them now, oh well, moving on. Editor here. I just played through the first 2 X games and realized that they actually did follow the same structure as Shovel Knight, where the boss rush was in the levels, or level, before the final boss, meaning that there wasn't lead up to the final boss, which is infinitely more fun. I really don't know why they reverted on this design decision. It's just really confusing to me, but whatever, just... I really can't believe they kept that in for the whole series. I don't think there's... I'd be surprised if anybody liked that decision. It is just not fun in the slightest. Genuinely just my least favorite part about this entire series. I still can't believe they made it a trend, and it's just such a shame because most of the boss fights throughout the series, whether they are well designed or not, are just generally fun to fight due to the different combos you can pull off in this game. Not that I really know any of them, but, you know, it's still cool to see. Just, I'm disappointed more than anything at this point. And that's all of the missions. Most of them okay, some great, some terrible. I was honestly surprised both factory missions came out as my favorites by miles compared to the rest, as I initially despised these levels on my first playthrough. It was honestly quite funny seeing the name of the song for this stage being Hell Plant, as that's probably how I would have described it after finishing the game for the first time. The missions as a package are just alright, but it's the life system in this game that's what truly makes these missions a pain sometimes. Instead of a normal life system, you have retries. The main problem comes from both how hard it is to get retries and how you can't get them back. For example, let's say you had 5 retries at the start of a stage and had to use them all up, and was then eventually forced to go to a previous save point since you ran out. Despite saving the game when you had those 5 retries before starting, you get none of them back. So if you run out of retries, you just have to finish every stage in one go until you get another. But at that point, you probably want to save them until you're at the endgame levels, since they're hard. I genuinely don't know how an action-oriented game forced me to hoard items like I'm playing an RPG. What the hell? But luckily, you do have another option if you don't want to use a retry or return to a previous save. You can give up. Yep. You want to know what giving up does? Permanently locks you out of a mission. You can do this on the missions that give you elemental chips. Huh? Imagine unknowingly making 1/3 of all future bosses harder just because you gave up on the hard mission that apparently had an elemental chip. I understand not wanting to force players to do hard missions, but this is just weird. Like, some of them should have been required at the very least. Especially with how you can't do this for mid-missions or final boss levels, obviously. I mean, what's even weirder is that this actually got praise from some people. Then again, that was IGN, so like, take that with a grain of salt. They did remove this in future games, realizing just how silly that whole decision was to begin with. But regardless, it's just baffling, really. Tangent aside, the missions are very rough for new players, to put it lightly. And some really begin to shine upon replaying the game, but most suffer from either enemy spam, lack of platforming, no personality, usually a mix of the three. But one thing I did like was how the locations of the missions are actually all tied in together. Remember when I mentioned that the game felt like it had Metroidvania inspiration? This was the major aspect I talked about. You can walk from the base into the surrounding area and end up in levels you've played through, and it's actually really cool and it makes the world feel small but interconnected, and I like how they handled it, even if it is pretty redundant at the end of the day. And of course, missions are one thing, but bosses, that's what Mega Man is truly known for. And this game honestly has some great fights, probably the best aspect of the game. I mean, outside of most mini-bosses, I found the majority of the end-stage bosses to be great. That being said, the game does struggle with damage output from the player. If you use the effective element against the boss, it goes down in no time at all 9 times out of 10. Meanwhile, if you don't use the effective element, or can't, because of this goddamn weapon system, most bosses will drag on an insanely long time. They're just given so much health for no reason. I decided not to grind weapons for footage, and I recorded for this video, and some bosses took me so long I lost major points for being slow. The train was one of the worst offenders for this. And I gotta say, the final boss was more of a pain than anything for me. I distinctly remember hating the second phase in both playthroughs due to high damage the boss dealt, and the extremely hard patterns to dodge at times, along with annoying invincibility phases, which just doesn't exist for nearly any other boss. Probably would have helped to have more health, but I'll get to that. Just a shame, because I found the first phase to be really fun. Easy to dodge attacks that are hard to read, making it so that you have to pay attention, plenty of opportunities to counterattack, along with having a nice balance of not too squishy or tanky. Truly a great boss, just brought down by a poor second phase in my opinion. Another point about the bosses in this game are the arenas you fight them in. Unlike your typical Mega Man box of an arena, most bosses actually lack any walls to cling to, or have much wider arenas. This removes most wall jump shenanigans, which makes it so screen-wide attacks aren't nearly as prevalent in this game, but it does make learning the boss fights a much faster experience, for better or for worse. I've seen some complain about this simplified boss design to be a negative for the game, but I generally prefer, as the terrible retry system makes it so you don't want to complete a stage and then keep dying on the boss. It's an absolute pain. There's still a noticeable learning curve to each boss, that part isn't gone, but it doesn't feel as apparent compared to later titles when they include your more standard single screen box arenas, which lends to much more devastating attacks since you have more mobility in the rooms you're placed in. However, this design for bosses is very apparent in this game's boss rush TM, where most of them can easily and quickly be taken out in very short time if you know what you're doing. And I don't mean in a pro type of way, despite how cool it is. I mean, seriously, I need to learn how to combo like that. That looks so cool. But rather in a simple game of timing charge slashes most of the time. Plus, some bosses are very easy to loop, which is a shame considering the variety of attacks they show. Harpuya specifically gave me an extreme trouble on my first playthrough until I unlocked the ice chip and decimated them in no time flat. Like, it's so easy to loop this boss. It's a bit insulting. They did fix this in later titles like most things, but god, this boss was a joke once you got ice chip. If I were to pick my favorites of the bunch in no particular order, it would probably be Phantom, Leviathan, and the Dragon Core you find in the first factory level. All these bosses have a nice range of attacks, allow you to take advantage of different openings, and don't die too easily or drag out too long. Plus they have some pretty fun EX moves. I also want to give a shout out to Leviathan because they are the only boss with an interesting arena, which does actually go to show the big difference it can make when playing against a boss. But again, it was mostly just other elements that made me prefer the boss fight design in this game compared to future games, although I do think it consistently improves throughout the series, so same difference at the end of the day. One thing I didn't mention about the bosses is EX moves, which bosses will actually pull off if they deem you a worthy opponent, which translates to have a rank A or S in the game. And this finally leads me to talking about how the game ranking works. This is probably one of my favorite aspects of the game upon replays. At the end of every mission, you are given points for your performance, with the average across all missions being your rank. There are 6 categories to get points from. Mission, how well you accomplished the goal of a mission. For example, how well you protected the NPC during the escort in the desert, which is gonna inevitably be not good, but regardless. Mission is kind of redundant because most of them just require defeating the boss, but it's still kind of cool sometimes. Time, how fast you complete the mission. Enemy, how many enemies you defeated during the mission. Damage, how little damage you took during the mission, in which you can take a couple points of damage and not lose any points, and then for like every 3 points of damage you take thereafter, you do lose 1 point every time you hit the 3-point threshold. It's very harsh in this first game, surprisingly. There's retry, how many retries you use during a mission, and cyber elf, how many cyber elves you use during a mission, but more on the cyber elves later. They all add up to 100 points total, with an S rank being 100 to 96 points, and every rank below being in segments of 10. A rank being 95 to 86, B 85 to 76, and it goes all the way down to F rank, where if you get below 45, you are bad at the video game. And I gotta say, I love the ranking system in this game. It adds a new challenge to the stages and feels rewarding to keep getting an A or S rank. My second playthrough specifically, I decided to rank hunt and kept getting A rank for the entire playthrough, and it was way more fun than I could have anticipated. Plus, the new boss moves, while they don't seem like much, they can definitely make bosses way more fun. I feel like the best example is during the trained core boss fight, how it will slowly close in on the player, which in turn makes all the other moves harder to dodge. It really forces you to know this boss inside out, and makes you very aware of your spacing. While it would have been frustrating on my first playthrough, it's now the fights I look forward to the most, especially due to the EX skill. It's just a great system. I mean, rewarding players? What a novel concept. Oh boy, I wonder what we get to talk about next. Oh yeah, Cyber Elves, the least rewarding system in this game. Now, if you couldn't tell, I don't like the Cyber Elf system. The only reason I find it more bearable than the weapon system is because the weapon system is something that actively hinders you throughout the gameplay, meanwhile Cyber Elves are just a bit more optional. Thank God. But what's so bad about them? Well, I like the Cyber Elf system in concept, like most things in this game. The execution is just abysmal. Getting the Cyber Elves is completely fine, All you have to do is look for a couple secret areas or defeat one type of enemy enough. Like, that's not hard, that's not grindy, you might need a guide to get all of them, but you could probably get like a third of them at the very least on a casual playthrough. That part's fine. The grinding for energy crystals is what annoys me. Some cyber elves are more powerful than others, and so they need a currency called energy crystals to fully awaken that power before you get to use them. And the prices are ridiculous. In a casual playthrough, you'd be lucky to get between 800 and 1,000 crystals. This equates to, let me check my notes here, oh, 1 max life up out of the 4 you can get throughout the game. Like, or you could get a speed boost, maybe 2. It's crazy. To get the useful upgrades like sub-tanks, which can hold spare life for later, or a defense up, you need to grind thousands of crystals, which this game just can't provide. That is, unless you look up a guide that has you abusing game drops through killing specific enemies with specific attacks. Like, replicating this was so weird. Why? Why is this the optimal way to grind? Why should I grind at all? Just, it's so poorly thought out. That's not even mentioning the worst part. You know how I said cyber elves affect your ranking? Well, basically, if you use none, you get max points. Use a couple, you get a penalty. Okay. The problem is that let's say you use a cyber elf in the base outside a mission to permanently upgrade your health. Guess what? That is a permanent penalty. A permanent penalty, mind you, of 10 points. So you are actually locked out of getting an S rank on stages. That's insane. That's not okay. I mean, hell, you might even get locked out of A ranking if you use enough of these. So, now, the rank system does take your average score, so if you were to do this near the end of a game, you could still maintain a good enough score, but it doesn't excuse how players are punished more than rewarded for finding these elves. Future games continue this trend, but in a much less harsh fashion, where you can get away safely with 2 or 3 upgrades before getting majorly punished in rankings. Like I said earlier, the latter stages of the game, especially the final boss, ask you to play extremely well if you don't have these upgrades due to the bad retry system, which you probably won't have the upgrades unless you spend tens of minutes of grinding. The grinding is at its worst in this title, thank God, but I'm in shock they found these prices acceptable to begin with. Like, why is it that I am punished for finding this cool super secret elf? Oh, hey, you got this cyber elf that can give you a sub-tank, one of the best upgrades in the game. Guess what you have to do to get it? Mindless grinding. Oh, that exploration you got to do for fun? Yep, no, well, that equates to grinding. And if you don't want to do that, well, you're gonna have a bad time in the rest of the game, pal, because this game's hard as fuck. And also punishing. Why? Why? I shouldn't be happier to find a small heal than a max life up just because it means less grinding, and yet here we are. By far, just such a poorly implemented system. 0-1 is a very flawed game. From lackluster level design, infuriating retry system, poor implementation of rewards, if you can even call them that, through the cyber elves, and the weapons that limit the gameplay for no good reason. But upon replaying the game a few times, it does still have its qualities such as the rankings, a solid collection of bosses, and a simple but engaging story if you wish to delve into it. I would say despite the initial frustrations with level design and the current frustrations with grinding, I'll always be able to come out of a session with this game having enjoyed it. But more importantly, it sets up a base for every future title to build upon, in which Inti Creates does an amazing job with this series later down the line. Every problem I mentioned here will get fixed, and that's awesome thing to hear. That is exactly what you want to hear in a long-running, well, okay, maybe not long-running, but in a game series such as this. Especially when the X series seemed to have dipped in quality around the time the Zero series came out, this was a great replacement for that. And honestly, for a first attempt at a completely new series with original elements and a completely different core gameplay loop from the predecessors, they did a good job. Despite all the issues with this game, I still see myself coming back to it, and I would say that goes to show how it still holds up to this day, especially compared to later titles. I still find fun in this game. And that's just about everything I have to say. Kind of. I will say this video was in the pipeline way longer than I would have anticipated and liked, and honestly, the worst part about making it was the constant feeling of, oh wait, I forgot to say this, oh wait, I want to mention that. Honestly, I do see myself coming back to talk more about this game. Who knows? I can't wait to talk about the next few games though. They are honestly such an amazing series. But until then, thank you very much for watching. And please, go play these games if you can. Especially if you're a Mega Man fan, these are great. And see you next time.